Hey, this is Dr. Ron McFarland with ISOL 531 Access Control, University of the Cumberlands, and today's lesson is on business drivers for access controls, access control policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. So those things that basically drive access control. Again, we're thinking of Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory. And just as a side note, if you are looking for Active Directory, there are some Unix variants of Active Directory, just to let you know. They sort of mimic what Active Directory does, and a lot of them are open source. I think there's two of them that are open source. Anyway, that's just kind of a sideline. Let's see our next item here. That's the page 1 slide. Again, a reminder that you can get all these slides online and download them. Data or information assets. Is it data or is it data? Either pronunciation is fine. An intangible asset with no form or substance is considered a data asset. When it's information, the difference is that information is something understood. Also, there's paper records, electronic media, intellectual property stored in people's heads, if you will, that are all considered assets, if you will. So, the importance of policy, again, last week we talked about what policy is, and senior management, again, the C-level role, vice president, president, etc. Organizations value intellectual property. IP is one of the biggest things. IP, again, intellectual property is one of the biggest things that's being stolen from U.S. companies. Intellectual property are those designs, those ideas, those concepts which uniquely make for our industrial base, if you will. Now we have to control the access to information to really ensure survival of the organization. In all reality, if you look online, there's, for the small and medium manufacturers, for example, a lot of the data breaches that have happened, a lot of times companies cannot survive when they get their intellectual property stolen. It's well over, for small and medium manufacturers, well over, I think it's well over 60% that can't survive a severe intellectual property theft. So look that up online. It's kind of a curious point, which kind of speaks to the veracity that we have to take when securing organizations. Let's see, third bullet down, protecting confidential information involves the technical controls and clear policies and sound business processes that implement these policies. I would flip that around from doing a lot of cybersecurity assessments. Policies and procedures are probably the best and first defense that you can take, and those policies and procedures should be supported with technical controls. Last bullet down, access control policies are effective only with support of senior executives. And now this is so true no matter what you're doing within the organization. If you don't get the senior buy-in, you're not going to get you'll get limited funding, if any funding, for projects, and you won't get all the internal infrastructure support that you need without senior executives. So their buy-in is always essential before doing any project, especially cybersecurity projects. Because cybersecurity projects, by the way, just to let you know, cybersecurity involves 40 to 45% technical, and the other 60%, 55% non-technical. So keep that in mind. Classification scheme. Classification scheme is a method of organizing sensitive information to access levels. Now, we've already talking about that with rights, roles, and responsibilities for different objects Okay? Only a person with the approved level of access is allowed to view information. Now, that could be, it says view information. You can even restate that. Only a person with the approved level of access is allowed to view, update, or delete, depending on what their role is, that information. So create, read, update, and delete. What's called CRUD, create, read, update, delete, or sometimes it's called ACID, add, delete, add, change it. I forget what the other one is, but add, ACID, or CRUD. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. I know we will. This access is called clearance. What does a person have clearance to do? We've heard of, for example, in the U.S. government, secret versus top secret, and there's various levels of top secret as well. So those are all access levels, and that affords that person the ability to do certain things. Now, every organization has its own method of determining clearance levels. We'll talk about some general schemes in this course. Now, national classification, I mentioned that the U.S. government, unclassified, things that can be out in the clear, no problem. Confidential, those are things that should not be shared only between perhaps two vendors or two organizations that are working with a government type of work. It's not really for the public to know. Secret, now those require more stringent controls, and certainly top secret with all the various levels of top secret require tighter and tighter controls, if you will. So in the manufacturing environment, when let's say Boeing passes out the need to make certain parts to subcontractors, oftentimes they'll pass on plans and drawings to that subcontractor to make, and those component parts are often called CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. You handle that in one way as opposed to classified restricted information. That gets handled in a much more stringent way versus any kind of unclassified information. Unclassified information might be something as simple as just a notice to the public that an event's happening for the public. Anyway, corporations will use kind of a similar type of track. They label it differently. Public information, something that's internal, so that internal memo should stay within. That's generally not for public consumption. Sensitive information, so there's more control on that. And then highly sensitive information, those things that maybe like intellectual property are considered highly sensitive within the corporation. So each one of these levels of classification, and there's several other different flavors of classifications that you'll run, but this is kind of the general essence of it. You'll have anywhere from non-structured all the way down up to structured levels of control. Need to know versus least privilege. Need to know is the requester should not receive access just because of his or her clearance, position, or rank. Now, they have to actually need to know that particular information. Requester must establish a valid need to see the information, see or use the information. Access should be granted only if the information is vital for the requester's official duties. Now, least privilege, kind of along that same line, a computer user or program should have only the access needed to carry out his or her job. Only the access. Now, declassification, we'll look at these in the upcoming slides. The automatic declassification, systematic declassification, mandatory declassification review, and Freedom of Information Act, sometimes FOIA, FOIA, you'll see that, Freedom of Information Act request. Business drivers for access control, the cost-benefit analysis. Okay, business driver can also B, the risk assessment for access control. The business facilitation, what it's going to be used for. The cost containment can be an access control. Operational efficiency can also be an access control. And IT risk management, which we're digging in deeper within this course. Now there's sections in the book that speak to each one of these, so focus on these 6 items, if you will. Here's a life cycle of an order. So this first person up here does an order creation. So this is an order. Customer has read-write access for the order. That goes into order processing. Now at that time, when you fill out, let's say, a form online, you submit it, order processing, the customer doesn't have write access anymore. It's sort of locked up. The customer only has read access. That way they can process that order as it is taken at a snapshot in time. Order processing has read-write to make changes should they see fit, and customer service has read-write access all the way through. So order processing and customer service. That gets passed on, for example, to shipping. Customer has read-only access. Shipping has read-write access because they're actually shipping out that item or a product. And customer service has read-write in order to make changes as requested by the customer. And so the order is finally closed. Customer has read-only access, and customer service only has read-only access. So that's kind of the life cycle. You can see where things are kind of locked in place, and which makes sense because you don't want read-write access throughout the process for the customer, because they could be changing their mind, and that would gum up the order processing and the actual shipping of the given product that the customer has requested. Controlling access and protecting value. Its importance for internal access controls. Now, the way this bullet reads right here, the essence is that access controls are essential internally, and particularly for the life cycle of a particular instance in the order processing or any other type of processing scheme. External access controls have certain restrictions because something coming in from the outside will always need to be restricted much tighter when it's entering into the infrastructure. Implementation of access controls with respect to contractors, vendors, and third parties is of key importance here. So look through that as well. Physical security. Now, oftentimes when you're doing cybersecurity, you're also talking about printed documents that are already existing in the organization, perhaps plans, perhaps some reports, perhaps some even things like canceled checks that are often still not always just filmed and deleted. Sometimes they actually have to hold on to certain checks or vouchers or receipts. Now, physical security of sensitive information always should be in behind a locked door and or locked cabinet. There should also be some sort of tracking of who enters in that doorway or exits. And of course, you can do that with RFID tags and or cameras, or some sort of sign-in log sheet that somebody maintains. So physical security looking at the slide, refers to the security of records and information not in electronic systems and applications. That, I want to say, is a key part of a lot of security issues that are in organizations. Not everything is in an information system. Like I said before, 40 to 45% on the average is in an information system. The rest is not. Access is regularly linked to functional responsibilities, not to position or grade. Just because you have a high-level position does not mean you have access to everything in the organization. Okay? Security or background investigation is always required and is certainly recommended in most areas, but it's always required for DoD, Department of Defense. It's also required for Let's say if you're doing some, working under ITAR restrictions, which is trade in arms regulations, if you will. ITAR stands for International Trade in Arms Regulations, and there's other kind of restrictions that both states and federal governments put on different companies. So those require security and background checks, and it's always a best practice to do that anyway, even if it's just a mom and pop organization. It may cost you a little bit up front, but it's much better in terms of security. Data destruction. There's always different methods to securing destruction. You have to log what you're going to destroy and destroy it in an appropriate manner. For example, when destroying hard drives for the Department of Defense, DoD has a certain regulations called FIPS, F-I-P-S, Federal Information Processing Standard for the destruction of hard drives down to a certain micron. It's not good enough for the federal government just to simply bash a hard drive with a hammer or drill holes in it like we used to do before. Now we have to have a grinder that's particular specifications. Likewise, with any other documentation, there's a log file that needs to be done, a secondary sign-off, and the appropriate destruction of that material. And that's in federal government, it's FIPS related, and in private sector, it could be ISO, or a private sector company could use the NIST standards as well. Do not put in trash bins. So many times when I was starting in digital forensics, 15 years ago at least, I would go down to, when I was starting to teach in digital forensics, I would go down to Goodwill and pick up several hard drives, actually buy a bunch of computers and pull out the hard drives for my classes, and we'd look for strings of 16 digits and then from the 16 digits, we'd pull that off and put it on a database and scan the first 4 characters to see if it was a Capital One or a Bank of America credit card, and then we'd pull the other associated information from that. All because a lot of people were not cleaning off their drives, and if they did, you can clean off your drives. Back then, you could wipe the drive up to 7 times, but you could still get software that would recover that. Now there's specifications on how many times drives are wiped clean. You can get certain software for that, so there's a lot of regulations regarding that and specifications around that, which many of you already know. So that gets back to the last bullet. Data is destroyed in accordance with guidelines. So depending on your organization, you'll have to look at those guidelines. Now, data destruction, up on the left-hand side, we have a light office shredder disintegrator, and it's a portable device, believe it or not, as big as that is. I've seen that put on the little wheelie carts and pushed around. Electronic media can be sanitized or shredded, and we talked a bit about that. You can get those large trucks over here. It's a company called Iron Mountain. I don't know if they're throughout the country, but they'll shred documents when they come to your organization to the specifications that you request, and they'll also shred the hard drives to the specifications that you request, and you can physically watch them do the destruction. They'll sign off as well on a tracker, so on a tracker being a log form. U.S. compliance laws for organizations. Compliance ensures that organizations implement more secure business practices. I suspect that right now NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology, and they do a lot of write-ups for security for the government organizations and contractors for the government, as well as ISO, International Standards Organizations, are working on a combined set of standards for a risk management framework for cybersecurity. I suspect in the future all businesses will have to have that. Again, in Lesson 1, I mentioned California's upcoming Consumer Protection and Privacy Act that goes in place within the year. That's essentially GDPR for California, and if any company does a business with California, which is a whole lot of companies since California has the bulk of manufacturers in the United States, they have to comply with that. So that would be compliance laws for organizations. Well, may have to adhere to California standards just because they're the big dog, or they may have to adhere to NIST standards because they're doing some sort of DoD work, or they may have to do some ISO standards because they're doing international. They may have to do GDPR or HIPAA, which you get the whole essence of that. So depending on the organization is that and what the organization's profile is the compliance that is associated with that. Okay. The Graham-Leach, I always call it Billy. Somebody called it the Liley Act, GLBA. That is a Financial Modernization Act of 1999. Protects personal financial information held by financial institutions. Now, from today's standards, that's still pretty loose. So there's been other twists and turns, but GLBA is one of the first acts that puts in protection for consumer information. GLBA has a privacy rule. In other words, the adherence that all organizations in the United States have to keep consumer information private, and as well as employee information private. The safeguarding rule and the pretexting rule, essentially that says the organization can't push the responsibility of keeping data secure off to another company. For example, if I owned an organization that had HR records as well as credit card information, and I stuck it on a cloud service provider, number one, that's kind of risky and it could be kind of stupid depending on how you set that up or don't set it up. But I can't then say, okay, now it's the cloud service provider's responsibility. My hands are clear. I'm responsible for all of that data wherever that data is. So that GLBA kind of gears that. Access control, organizations should define who can access and for how long. So the timing is a key portion of GLBA. Access to sensitive data must be logged, and everything's being logged nowadays, or it should be, especially the key security items. Data security encompasses storage, the policies that have to be written, the procedures. Again, policies and procedures, think of them together as an object that you always have to do. Policies, the overarching discussion of what needs to be done. The procedures are the step-by-step process that you'll have to ensure that the policy is being adhered to. Equipment that holds sensitive information has to be looked at. What do you do with your hard drives? What do you do with those copiers that, let's say if you have a copier device that's being shared by 100 people in the organization, that has a hard drive. What are you going to do with that? You should actually have that hard drive pulled when the copier gets recycled and pay for that hard drive and have that hard drive shredded. That could be written up in a policy of how you handle your printers, as well as perhaps print servers and copiers in the organization. I've mentioned HIPAA. That started in 1996. A key component of security information privacy for patients. If you have patient information, if you go out on the dark web, patient information is the highest premium for per record. In other words, credit card information is, you can get a lot of that on the dark web, but the HIPAA stuff, health information stuff, not only contains typically the credit card information, but also all the health background information on an individual, so as well as Social Security number and everything else. So it's a whole ball of wax for HIPAA information on the dark web. That's the most costly information. If you're a hacker and you're buying information on the web, HIPAA information is the most expensive. Protects the privacy and security of certain health information. The Office of Civil Rights enforces the privacy and security rules. So civil rights is all of our rights. So the Office of Civil Rights does a really good job on controlling this, if you will. And there's some significant penalties for non-compliance. That's why if you're going to work for a hospital or an insurance company, you're going to deal with HIPAA strictly, and also regarding companies. Any company that deals with health insurance has to rely on the insurance company and the HIPAA constraints that the insurance company will provide to the organization for their HR department. Again, HIPAA rules: privacy rule, transaction and code set rule, the unique identifier standards rule, security rule, and the enforcement rule. We'll look at that, each one of these. HIPAA privacy rule on one side, HIPAA security rule on the other side. Now, the HIPAA privacy rule, the privacy of individual identified health information, PIIH. So individual health information is actually a key asset. If a hacker knows Social Security number, address, date of birth, and some health information about a particular victim, they can manipulate the situation quite a bit. There's certain national standards for the protection of health information. Those have to be adhered to, and there's a rule book of at least 500 pages and maybe 600 pages that you have to follow. Each one of those policies have to be put into practice. The security rule sets the standards for the protection of electronic health information, and those standards are actually implemented in a lot of database products now. So if you have a homegrown system, you'll have to go ahead and implement those. So a lot of people are shedding those type of systems off in lieu of the more compliance-oriented health information packages that are on the market. And by the way, that also gears the transmission of HIPAA information. Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, protects investors by requiring the accuracy and reliability in corporate disclosures. Now, this occurred with some of the financial shenanigans that happened in the stock markets in particular. New standards of corporate accountability, they're a decade or so old, but that basically prevents a lot of the CEO, the C-levels from obfuscating, if you will, some of the financial reports that could mislead masses of consumers into investing into their company when their company is not doing so well. So, and SOX created new penalties for acts of wrongdoing. You'll hear now of when somebody breaches this, you could see a C-level going to jail and being fined a significant amount. It changes how corporate boards and executives must execute and exchange information and work with corporate auditors. So there's no, again, obfuscating the data that corporate auditors have given them in order to drive up stock market prices, which did occur in the past. Again, SOX specifies new financial reporting requirements, and that goes to the Security Exchange Commission and other entities such as that, and requires that all financial reports include an internal control report. And that internal control report essentially says, that the auditor agrees and with what the corporate reporting is doing versus the corporate reporting kind of being washed by the board of directors, which occurred in the past. Auditing firms are also required to attest to the accuracy of the assessment, and you can see the Sarbanes-Oxley self-attestment at the end of some corporate documents, especially on financial reporting. Here's the different sections: Section 201, 302, 404, and 409. Section 201 of SOX, services outside scope of auditor practice. So that's a little bit more in detail about the scope of what an outside auditor can do. Section 302 speaks to the corporate responsibility for financial reporting. Again, getting back to the obfuscating earlier of reports done by the board of directors to drive up stock prices. That again is a no-no with Section 302. Section 404 speaks to the internal controls for the assessment and how that is being managed. That needs to be reported directly to the Federal Exchange Commission and other such entities, and also disclosed on reports. Section 409 speaks to the real-time disclosure on reporting that a consumer or other advocacy group can partake in if they wish to when digging through the finances of an organization. This SOX prevents a lot of corruption and collusion. I know still a lot of that happens, but this tightens the strings a lot, and it puts the board of directors and the C-level employees on notice that they can receive jail time and significant fines, which we've seen in the news over the past 5 to 10 years. Again, a couple more sections with Sarbanes-Oxley. Section 802, the criminal penalties, which I mentioned. Section 806, protection of exposing fraud by employees. So this is the whistleblower exemption, if you will. Section 807, the criminal penalties for defrauding stakeholders, which tie to Section 802, altercation of the document. So those two go hand in hand whenever you're seeing punishment being advertised, if you will, in the news. FERPA, I mentioned this probably the last lesson. FERPA is one of the guidelines that protect us. I occasionally go to take classes. My information is protected in the classroom environment by FERPA, as is your information. The right to inspect and review, who gains access to that? Generally, it's the person who is signed up for school and taking classes. They have the rights to share access or not to share access. The right to correct records, that's up to you. You can do that. And the parental written permission is required. So if you're 19 and your parents paying for you, or if you're an adult and you're paying for a 19, 20-year-old person in college, you and I don't have the rights as parents to call up the school and say, hey, I want Billy Bob's records. You have to Billy Bob has to sign off on permission so you can see his records, even if you're paying for it. So that's part of that whole thing. I've been through that, not only as a parent, but also as an academic dean. Let's see, items exempt from FERPA. Private notes made by faculty or staff for the purpose of assisting memory. So you can't claim as a parent those private notes made by faculty are not part of FERPA documents. Law enforcement records are not part of FERPA. Medical records or statistical records that contain personal identifiable information, sometimes called PII. Pre-graded material before the final grade is determined by faculty. That's exempt from FERPA. By the way, the final grade is FERPA, so are graded materials. Those are FERPA. So if the 19-year-old refuses to give mom the final report, technically they don't have to, but I know that gets into family issues, which is beyond the scope of this course. Directory information. Now, directory information, students and parents must be informed about directory information, and there's no particular objections in FERPA to be raised. This is directory information. Essentially, you can look at it as information that can be found on the web, so there's no FERPA within that, just both parents and the student needs to be informed that the directory's out there and that they can make changes to it. Name, address, telephone number, email address, dates of attendance, degree earned, enrollment status, field of study. Now, all of those are generally things that you can find out in a directory. Let's see. Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. That's another act. CALEA. LEA is a Law Enforcement Act, Consumer Assistance. This requires telecommunication carriers and equipment makers used by telecom industry to facilitate electronic surveillance activities of law enforcement agencies. Now, of course, there would be a requirement to invoke this of some sort of warrant, but this actually is the hook that will assist in getting telecommunications industry to do some sort of surveillance. Now, firms subject to CALEA, here's the key, must cooperate with legitimate law enforcement requests. For example, a certain service, if you will, has to be served on, let's say, Verizon, and that has to be a legal document and just can't be hearsay. The Children's Internet Protection Act, CIPA requirements. CIPA is really important to keep predators at bay, if you will. The internet is full of trolls that are after children. Schools and libraries must use technology and other protection measures to safeguard children 17 years of age or less. They must also protect, the school does, children from exposure to offensive internet content, and they must adopt and enforce policies to monitor online activities of minors. So if you have a predator who is actually hired in a school environment, which is kind of a hard one to kind of like monitor, you have to make sure that as far as the information system, you're monitoring the activity of students and even activity of faculty and staff within, to make sure that that the students' rights in terms of CIPA aren't being violated. Also, rights outside when a student is on the internet, or one of the biggest areas of child predators is actually the Xbox environment in the gaming areas, where so that if I'm running a school that has some gaming environments, I would be extremely aware of the CIPA environments and watch and monitor the texts that are coming in through those forums to see if some 45-year-old posing as a 16-year-old is trying to hit up on one of the students. So that's the kind of things that we have to look for as security professionals. We want to protect our children especially because they're the innocent victims of a lot of this shenanigans that's going on. Anyway, Title 21 of CFR Part 11, Code of Federal Regulations. You'll get into this with digital forensics, especially. Calls for all FDA-regulated organizations to implement system access limited to authorized individuals. This is pretty standard nowadays. The use of operational system checks, the use of authority checks, and the use of device checks. So in a lot of the models, these regulations are also reflected. So you'll see these Title I CFR represented over and over again. Title 21 of CFR Part 11 calls for FDA-regulated organizations to implement appropriate education and task training. And again, with a lot of the risk management framework that we're going to go over in this course, training is an essential part of what we need to make sure happens within the organization. Again, 70% of the data breaches are caused because of some mishandling, whether it's a clicking on a link or some other mishandling of data that a user does. So ongoing training is essential. So Title 21 of CFR points to education and training. You'll see training mentioned in the NIST standards as well as ISO and other standards that are coming down the pike. Appropriate controls for documentation in place, controls for both open systems and closed systems related to electronic signatures. That's why recently, as of the last 4 or 5 years, you've seen a lot of signatures being protected with products like DocuSign. This is because of the regulations around those signatures. And signatures are certainly a personal identifiable piece of information that you don't want shared around the internet for many reasons, if you will. So the NERC, North American Electric Reliability Council, handles the regulation of electricity and utility companies. Now, if you look at NERC, they also have a lot of stringent standards around cybersecurity. If you could imagine taking down a country's electrical infrastructure would be quite tempting to countries such as Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and other bad actors. So NERC is pressing a lot of the cybersecurity information. Let's see the second bullet down. Ensures that North American energy network is secure, adequate, and reliable by many of the standards. The third one down requires physical protective measures for critical infrastructures. Now, again, I'm getting back to the 40-45% for information systems, 60% or a little bit less for the physical infrastructure. So if you think of an actual power plant, let's say a nuclear power plant, for example, I can think of one that's close to here in Arizona, Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station. Not only do you have to be concerned with all of the information systems there and what data gets updated, changed, or deleted on that information system, but certainly NERC is concerned with the perimeter control and the control of the physical structure and who gets in and who gets out of that physical structure for many obvious reasons. So NERC is that kind of regulatory council, reliability council that kind of administers a lot of the security controls. And when you're talking about something like a power plant, not only do you have like NERC, if you're working for a power plant, not only do you have NERC, but you also may respond to a lot of the federal and state regulations as well. So there's many regulations in an organizations that kind of are the key drivers of the process and procedures that oversee the security. Again, I mentioned this electronic security guidance. Background checks are required. Again, another instance of a background checking requirement from another organization. And again, training is essential. So you'll see training, background checks over and over mentioned in a lot of these standards. Homeland Security, Department DHS, I'm going to kind of skim through some of these because it's a little bit of the same. Part 1 covers common identification, security, and privacy requirements. Again, privacy is a key element of the data that we store, as well as who gains access to that information. Part 2 deals with the uniformity and portability of identification, how uniform and how flexible is that identification, if you will. And that's where the two-factor authentication comes into play with DHS. Access control. Again, access control, if you look down at this list from DHS, and this is also in the private sector. Facilities, again, that's 55 to 60%. The systems, and systems I would actually put the application and data underneath the systems. Remote access is also kind of another bailiwick because remote access, if you don't secure your remote access with certain constraints like VPN and other encryption or any other kind of software product, you're really opening the environment to some cybersecurity risks. So remote access is something that you should put a highlight on, because that's a critical egress for a lot of companies, if you will. Best practices in the public sector, we'll see some replication of what we've already talked about here. Conduct periodic risk assessments. A risk assessment for cybersecurity should be done at a very minimum once a year. I know and I work with some companies who do a quarterly risk assessment. And certainly if you've had a breach, not only after that breach is occurred, documented, and mitigated, a risk assessment needs to occur again right after that breach. So it could occur much more frequently, depending on the risk profile of the organization. It could occur much more frequently than a quarterly. So the second bullet down, implement policies and procedures based on the most recent risk assessment. In other words, I've seen a lot of risk reports, and I've written a lot of risk reports, and that the company hasn't taken any action on. One of the NIST standards is not only to write the risk report and do a gap analysis, but also to develop a plan of action and milestones. And DoD, Department of Defense, will check all of those manufacturers that are working for DoD and to make sure that they're actually taking action on their stated plans. And it's interesting that a lot of companies will make a security plan, they won't do anything with it but put it up on a shelf. So keep that in mind. A security plan needs action. So that's where you get the notion of POAM, plan of action and milestones. So it's a project plan that has actionable milestones that have to be adhered to. Bullet down is conduct employee and contractor training. Oh boy, training again. So again, training. I skipped one. Let's see. Create plans for security of network systems and other resources. So those network diagrams, those system diagrams, those data flow diagrams, those application diagrams, all of those need to be part of the security plan. Those need to be examined for security holes or examined for best practices. And also the last bullet here, test periodically to ensure that policies and procedures designed to lower risk are working correctly. So not only design the plan, but implement the plan, but frequently test that plan to make sure it works. There's also another notion of reporting an incident response, if you will. Create processes to address shortcomings in security policies, procedures, and practices. Implement processes for detecting and reporting, and incorporate continuous plans for the organization. These are all best practices. You build it, you define a gap analysis, you define what needs to be done, and you start working on implementing those changes. You periodically assess it. You may come up with new things that need to be mitigated, so you'll put those on the action plan, and you prioritize that action plan. You put resources to those plans, and you start chipping away at that plan. Little by little, you're going to get that plan pretty much handled, and then upon the next round of assessment, you'll come up with more. So it's cybersecurity is an ever-evolving process, if you will. It's not just a check-off list, boom, you're done. It's continuous, if you will. So is training. One other aspect, SCADA. SCADA are those devices that are controlled, though not necessarily by, they're controlled digitally, but the devices may be more, for example, a SCADA device may be something attached to a water tower. So we've seen water tower or water tanks throughout the city. The city will control the flow of water in and out of that tank, typically with a SCADA system. SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So that on that water tower, there's almost like a pump that you would see inside. So almost like the leveler that you'd see inside the backside of a toilet, which that'll tell how high the water is in the tank, and if the tank needs to be refilled. So that device, that information is sent back through a SCADA controller, and through the network it determines yes or no, add more water to this particular pump. The Department of Homeland Security did a test about 5 years ago throughout the United States for all those type of SCADA devices, and found about 75% of the tested devices were not in any kind of security compliance. Now that was 5 years ago, and what that meant is SCADA systems are highly hackable, and so if a hacker wanted to get into the cities, let's say a city as small as Flagstaff, Arizona, or maybe as large as Los Angeles, there's some possibility that they can get in and dump all the water tanks based on the SCADA system. So that's a critical infrastructure. Imagine if all the water tanks in your city were dumped immediately, and you were in the middle of a drought. There would be some significant issues. So SCADA systems monitor and control telecommunications, as well as wastewater, energy systems, transportation. And this slide's a little bit, has extra bullets that it shouldn't have. But anyway, SCADA systems are a point of risk for utilities that use them. And most utilities now use SCADA systems. They're one of the weakest, least secure areas. And if you wanted to get into cybersecurity and SCADA, or cybersecurity and IoT, those are two rich areas to do a lot of work in. Access control, public sector, create processes to address shortcomings, implement, and incorporate. Here we're seeing the same notion, if you will. Let's see, access control framework identifies the importance of protecting access and leading practices to achieve protection. And again, documentation and management understanding and management commitment are essential portions of the access control policy. Access control policy explicitly state responsibility, who does what. So with like a plan of action and milestones, you specify who does what and what level of commitment they have. And in fact, there's another document that you might see called RASCII, R-A-S-C-I-I, and that ties a person's roles and responsibility to a particular instance. My role in a particular event I may be responsible for setting up the network and the routers to protect, and firewalls to protect the ingress and egress and how that data traffic goes through the network. So I would have a very active role, where somebody else on that same team may just need to be reported to that process has been done. So their role would be different on that RASCII matrix. So that's part of the access control policy setup. Explicitly state the responsibilities for team members, who's accountable for what, and also you want to add in there the time frame. Establish and embed management's commitment. Again, nothing happens because of the funding and the authority without management commitment. Authorize the expenditure of resources and inform those who need to know. Okay, so you need to devise a communication plan. A communication plan lists all your interested parties, and even some of those that may not be interested but need to know, and when they need to know. Do they need to know daily, weekly, or when something occurs? That frequency. Last bullet, provide later documents for consultation to verify achievement of objectives. In other words, you want to have an outside reviewer look at your policies and procedures to see, in fact, if things were done correctly, and also if those items that are on the list are actually being acted upon. Access control standards refer to a collection of requirements that must be met by anyone who performs a given task or works on a particular system. And that was mentioned a little bit before in terms of the Rasky matrix. Access control procedures tell how to do something. And then within the procedures, anytime you are looking at policies versus procedures, policies are overarching. Procedures are how to do something and step by step how to accomplish the task, and also kind of inform the user how the knowledge is transferred, if you will. That could be part of the procedure. In other words, inform when this process is done, when this procedure is done, that a report needs to be done or information needs to be submitted to a particular database and that sort of thing. So the access control procedures need to have some sort of follow-up to report back up the channel, if you will. Access control guidelines. Now, the difference between a mandate and a guideline is sort of like best practices. Guidelines are generally accepted practices. I put best practices. They're not mandatory, but they're actually strongly suggested. Let's put it that way. They allow the implementation, but they also allow some flexibility in that implementation. And that's where the alternative means may occur. For example, if the access control guidelines require a label be placed on a device, you may decide as a guideline that label can be put on with a piece of tape and a marker, or it may be a printed label that you print off the printer. Either one, the guidelines would probably recommend the printed label versus a hand-drawn label, if you will. But that still allows for some flexibility should those guidelines be talking about an off-site location where you have to do some marking up. Policies, there's an acceptable use policy for access control. You'll see an acceptable use policy example, like if you go to the public library, there's usually before you use that computer, an AUP pops up saying you will not violate the principles of this, that, and the other, nor send inflammatory email. So it gives you the AUP for the user at that terminal. You should have that at your terminal at work too. Password policy, what the length and duration for that password. The account management policy, how that needs to be managed, and even things like an account management, when somebody terminates, do you terminate that person's account right away, or do you hang on to it? Hopefully you terminate it right away. Remote access policy, again, the bailiwick of remote access, who gains access. And if they gain access, they better be using something like VPN or some other secure encrypted way to connect, because remote access can be a big wide open field for a hacker to get into. So those policies need to be established. Standards to support security policies, user account standards. We're going to talk more about that in upcoming sessions. User account standards could be things in terms of what is the user's name. You don't want to use always use their email name. You may want to use something else other than an email name. That could be one aspect that you're looking at. Because if a hacker has your email name and you're using the email name for entry into the payroll system, it may not be a good practice. So you may want to think about that. Identification standards, how people are identified within the system. Again, the remote access standard and the application development standard, who does what to particular applications. That we're going to look at a little bit more. So that being said, our homework 2 assignment, Read chapters 3 and 4 in the textbook. There's a lot of good information in these particular texts, and that leads up to some of the key concepts that we'll talk about through chapters 7 and 8 as well. So complete labs 3 and 4 and the quizzes associated with that. And remember, all items are due by 11:59 at the end of the week. So give yourself plenty of time so you don't get that lockout time. And let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, and we'll go from there. Well, have a good day, and I will talk to you soon.